Hello, this is Professor Gavoor. We're going to cover Chapter 3 of the Popenstax book, and we're getting into demand and supply. This is where the economic magic, if you will, starts to happen. We're going to cover all 5 sections, of course: demand, supply, equilibrium in markets for goods and services, shifts in demand and supply for goods and services, changes in the equilibrium price in quantity, and there's a 4-step process associated with that, the concept of price ceilings and price floors, and demand, supply, and efficiency. Let's consider organic vegetables. They used to be grown locally when they first started, and with great pride by entrepreneurial small farmers. It has since caught on. But at the beginning, they used to cost more, even though they were grown and sold in the same basic geographic area. It's because the farmers were on a smaller scale. It's because maybe the cost of materials were not in high supply at the time. And so they paid more, you paid more to get that kind of organically grown produce. If you go to at least the grocery stores I go to now, almost all vegetables and produce and fruits are organically grown these days. And the price differential is not where it used to be. I think people have demanded better quality and better grown using less harmful chemicals to both human beings to grow vegetables and produce, or produce and fruits, but also less impactful in a negative way to the environment. So supply and demand has changed over time. There was a short-term version of it a few years ago when organic vegetables were not readily available, and that has shifted and it's become the norm. You'll see that happen a lot. We're going to study probably more the short term. So demand, supply, equilibrium in markets for goods and services. Demand. It's how much of a good or service consumers, people like you and me that go and use our money and buy stuff, and it could be also firms, depending on what the good or service is, how much they're willing to buy at each price. Price is what a buyer pays for a unit of a specific good or service. It's the price that they're charging for it. The quantity demanded is, well, how much are you willing to purchase at a given price? So we have these points. It's a price and quantity kind of combo that go together. And then you have the law of demand. It says keeping all other variables that affect demand constant. Keep all other variables that affect demand constant. There's a Latin term, ceteris, like etc. Ceteris, C-E-T-E-R-I-S, paribus, P-A-R-I-B-U-S. And that's you'll hear that term sometimes in economics, and it means all other things constant. So a lot of times, much like when we talked about movie tickets and or watermelons and movie tickets, or burgers and bus tickets, or whatever it was we talked about in the last chapter, we talked about 2 things and held everything else constant. That term, ceteris paribus, applies here. Keeping all other variables constant. If the price goes up, the demand goes down. If the price goes down, the demand goes up. Why do people put things on sale? They think they will sell more. They lower the price so that they sell more. The demand for that goes up. If they raise the price, well, they shouldn't be surprised if the demand goes down. There's 2 ways of summarizing this information. One is a schedule. A schedule is pretty much something used in economics more than it is in business. I think people just call them tables now. It's what you see in an Excel spreadsheet. It's columns of numbers that represent something. So in this case, a demand schedule is a table that shows the range of prices for a certain good and a quantity demanded at each price. A demand curve is the graphic representation of the demand schedule or that table. I'll use table and schedule interchangeably. You'll have to excuse me. So the quantity is always on the x-axis, the horizontal axis. The price is always on the vertical axis. Let's take a look at this. Here's one for gasoline. Quantity of gasoline, millions of gallons. It's probably for a day, I guess. And here's the price on the y-axis. The quantity in most of these economic graphs that we will look at henceforth is always on the x-axis. The dollar figure, be it price, be it cost, be it revenue, be it profit, is always on the y-axis. So you'll see that gasoline ranges from $2.20 to $1 in 20-cent increments. And as we see, as the price goes down, the quantity consumed goes up. This gives a negative sloping curve. It's downhill as you read from left to right. And this is always indicative of a demand curve. Now, if it's sharply downhill, well, then it's very sensitive to price changes. And we're going to talk about that in 2 chapters from now. If it's very shallow, price changes do not affect the, well, if it's very sharp, price changes do not affect. I said it actually backwards. Excuse me for that. I'm half asleep here. I'm only on my second cup of coffee. If it's a very sharp decrease, you're going to have big changes in price, small changes in quantity. So in that case, it's a very sharp downhill slope of this thing, of this demand curve. You will find that relatively large changes in price have small changes in quantity. Probably gasoline is like that. People need gasoline to drive to work. The only time that really changed was during the COVID pandemic, when a lot of people just didn't drive anywhere. I think it took me 4 months to use a gallon of, a tank of gasoline in my car. That's crazy. Okay, downward slope. If it's a very shallow slope, a small change in price will have a dramatic increase in the quantity consumed. On the other hand, there's something called supply. Supply is the amount of good or service the producers are willing to supply at a given price. The quantity supplied is the total number of units of that good or service the producers are willing to sell at a given price. And like there is a law of demand, there's a law of supply. As the price goes up, the supply goes up. As the price goes down, the supply goes down. Well, these are the producers. If the price is going up, they're willing to produce lots and lots of the good or service because they're making more and more revenue from that. On the other hand, if the price is going down due to the marketplace for some reason, then they don't want to supply as much. Like during the COVID pandemic, this worked very well. The price was going down because people just were not buying gasoline. So they're like, I'm not going to make as much gasoline. I'm not going to refine as much of the product. I'm not going to drill as much of the product because it's all going to stockpile up. Like you have demand schedules, you have supply schedules. It's a table that shows that same quantity and price pairing. And a curve, a supply curve, is a graphic illustration of the schedule. Okay, so we have demand, we have supply. We have a law of demand, which says the price goes up, the quantity consumed goes down. If the price goes down, the quantity consumed goes up. It's an inverse relationship. We have a demand schedule. We have a supply or a demand curve. We have the tabular form of it and a graphic representation. For supply, we have the same thing. We have the law of supply, which says if the price goes up, the supply goes up. If the price goes down, the supply goes down. We have a supply schedule, which is a table showing this paired relationship from a supply side of pricing and quantity supplied. The curve is a graphic representation of that again. So look at this. This curve goes uphill. Because remember, as the price goes up, the quantity they're willing to supply goes up. As the price goes down, the quantity they supply goes down. So it's an uphill, positively sloped. And again, we have the same numbers, $1, $2.20. I don't know how reflective this is of recent gas prices, so they should always put dates on these graphs. It goes from $1 to $2.20 in 20-cent increments. And at $1, they're only willing to supply 500 million gallons of gasoline, presumably a day. And at $2.20, they're willing to supply 720 million gallons of gasoline per day. The supply curve is created by graphing the points of the supply schedule, just like the demand curve was created by graphing the points from the demand schedule. The upward slope illustrates this law of supply that, like we talked about. Now, equilibrium is where quantity demanded equals quality supplied. If I look at these two curves, upward sloping, downward sloping, if I graph them at the same time, they're going to make kind of an X. And at the vertex of the X, where the two parts cross, where the two curves cross, that's where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. The combination, so equilibrium, and these are terms you should really kind of take to heart here. I guess that means memorize, but you don't have to like actually memorize them, like put them on flashcards. Memorize them from doing the homework, memorize from doing the reading, so that you understand what the concepts are. The combination of price and quantity where there is no economic pressure from the surplus or shortages that would cause price or quantity to change. It's where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. And there's obviously at that, when quantity and supply are quantity demanded, quantity supply are equal, guess what? The price for the quantity demanded and the price for the quantity supplied are going to be the same. So the price where quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. The equilibrium quantity is this quantity, the equality. Surplus or excess supply at an existing price. It's the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded. A shortage or excess demand is at an existing price where the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied. If we graph these two gasoline curves, we see all these points. And there's a lot of dotted lines, and there's all kinds of letters. So S, supply curve. D, demand curve. Demand curve always downward sloping. Supply curve always upward sloping. We have an X. That point E is the equilibrium. It's where the curves 600 and $1.40. Now, if I try to, if the people selling the gasoline try to sell it for $1.80, so I don't know when gasoline was routinely $1.40, I'm going to say, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago, so this is probably an old graph. Doesn't matter, it's for, it's an example and for learning purposes only. So at $1.80, you could see that the supply, they're willing to supply, 675, 680, or something like that. But the demand at that price is only 500. So the supply, quantity supply, is greater than the quantity demanded. You're going to have an excess or surplus of gasoline in the marketplace. You are then going to get pressure. These guys don't want to have all that inventory hanging around. They'd love to get rid of it. What do they do to get rid of it? Let's have a sale. Let's lower the price. So the pressure is to lower the price. Now, if we go below the curve, and let's say for some reason the price is artificially set at $1.20. Well, now the people that are making the gasoline only want to make 550 million gallons a day. They only want to supply that much. But the people consuming the gasoline are willing to then take 700 at that price, they would love to buy 700 million gallons of gasoline a day. Well, what does this mean? We have more demand than we have supply. So there's a shortage. What do the people that are supplying it think? Hey, there's so many people that want gasoline, I can raise the price. So if they can raise the price, they will. And we get upward pressure when there's a demand, excess demand or shortage. There's pressure on pricing to increase, but when there's an excess supply or surplus of a good, there's a pressure for the price to decrease. And it's all aiming for this equilibrium price. Now, how quickly it gets there is a different thing. We're not talking about the time aspect of it yet. And probably in this course we won't address that in great detail. But some markets are more responsive than others, let's put it that way. But eventually, all markets feel these pressures. That's the model that we're looking at here. We talked about this term ceteris paribus, other things being equal. Any given demand or supply curve is based on ceteris paribus. Like one of the ceteris paribus things would be, here's our supply and demand for gasoline prices, assuming everything else is fixed. Like people are driving the same amount, not like a pandemic, the pandemic experience we just had where people all of a sudden start driving a lot less because so many other variables change so quickly. So the demand curve can be used to identify how much consumers would buy at a given price. Remember, quantity always on the x-axis. The dollar figure, in this case, we're studying price only. We're not looking at revenue or cost or profits yet. The price reflects the quantity demanded. If the price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down. If the price goes down, the quantity demanded goes up. That's the law of demand. So here's two ways of looking at it. We could have consumers will purchase large quantities, pushing demand to the right. So this is not a change in pricing and demand. This is not a change in demand. This is a shift in demand. And I think the shift in demand, in our case, went the other way. So this shows an increase. The whole demand curve shifts from here to here, from demand to demand prime, from demand curve 1 to demand curve 2. Now, if that happens at the same price, the quantity demanded increases at every price. That would be a shift in demand. More likely, during the COVID pandemic, we were here, and then all of a sudden at the same price, the actual demand for gasoline shifted to the left in this case, as opposed to increasing or shifting to the right. So if we look at this, here's demand 0, here's demand 1, which is an increase in demand, a shift, and here's demand 2, which is more like the pandemic, we had a decrease. Increased demand means that at every given price, the quantity demanded is higher, so that the demand curve shifts to the right from D0 demand curve to D1 demand curve. A decreased demand, however, means that at every price the quantity demanded is lower for the same price. So the demand curve shifts from D0 to D1. What happened during the pandemic? We went from like a D0 to D1 kind of demand curve because people just stopped driving. This is ceteris paribus. The only thing that changes is the price and the quantity, but when we shifted, other things moved, the underlying assumptions that were held constant change, we get this kind of shift. So here they're looking at the price of $20,000. So I don't think we're talking about gasoline anymore. They've shifted actually the example that we're using. And so here's where we started. the price was 20,000, and they would sell 18 million of those. If the demand shifted to the right, which means the demand increased overall, the same price of 20,000, we would sell 20 million. But if it shifted negatively, which means decreased at the same price, we would only sell 14.4. A shift in demand happens when something in an economic factor other than price causes a different quantity to be demanded at every price. What happens? Well, everyone's income changes. The changing tastes or preferences, changes in the compositions of the population, price or substitute of a complement changes, and we're going to talk about what a complement good is. Changes in expectations about the future. So, these shifts come when there's like recessions or boom times or. If you think back to 2008 to 2010, the Great Recession, everybody's income went down. People had very negative views about the expectation about the future. That forced demand in almost all categories except food essentials, etc., to shift to the left. Sometimes there's a change in preference. People are drinking a lot less carbonated sodas now, and that has nothing to do with the soda companies like Coca-Cola and Pepsi, who have had to adapt to that by shifting their product offering to less carbonated alternatives. Changes in the composition of the population. The income and changes in expectation about the future, that can happen relatively quick. The changes in tastes and preferences, changes in the composition of the population are more gradual, generally. As people age out, the Cadillac used to be a popular car in the United States. The demand has gone down for Cadillac. The demand curve has shifted to the left because younger people did not want their fathers, and then those fathers were grandparents or great-grandparents' luxury car. They were looking for things that more appealed to them. So that shifted, and people are buying more European and maybe Japanese luxury cars. The change in moving away from carbonated sodas, same thing. So if it increases, the tastes shift to a greater popularity, population likely to buy rises, the income rises for a normal good, and we're going to talk about what all these kinds of goods are. Price of substitution rises, price of a complement falls. We're going to talk about what a complement and substitutes are. And future expectations encourage more buying. If the demand shifts to the left, which means it goes down, taste shift, and what you're talking about, the good or service, becomes less popular. Population likely to buy decreases. Income drops for a normal good. Price of the substitute falls, or the price of the complement rises. So we have to look at what a substitute and complement goods are. And future expectations discourage buying. We've talked about some of that. Well, now we've used these terms, let's define what they are. A normal good is a product whose demand rises when income rises and vice versa. Okay, so most goods are normal goods. A product whose demand rises when income rises. It's not price now, it's how much money you have. Am I going to buy more wine, more steak, more whatever it is when my income rises? Yes, I'm going to buy better choices of cuts of meat. I'm going to, and those are going to increase. On the other hand, an inferior good doesn't mean it's a bad good. It just means a product whose demand falls when income rises and vice versa. They have too many words here. A substitute good is a good or service where we can use one in place of the other. A complement is a good or service that are often used together. Ice cream and cones, ice cream and hot fudge, hot dogs and hot dog buns, hamburgers and hamburger buns. So if the price of hamburger buns for some reason goes crazy, it goes way up, people are going to probably, gee whiz, I'd like it to have hamburgers, but the price of buns are so high, I'm not going to buy so much. A substitute good is coffee and tea or other carbonated. So if the price of coffee goes up too much, the price of tea stays the same, the consumption of tea should increase. And vice versa. If the price of tea goes very high or very low, it will affect the consumption of coffee. Now, when we talk about normal goods and inferior goods, what are we talking about? A normal good is just something that you know you would buy more often if you had more money. But oftentimes, when you have less money, you still might need a shampoo, but you might buy a value brand. So in a normal time, and I can't believe I'm talking about shampoo, someone that uses almost none of it these days, but you might have a name brand shampoo. Pick your favorite shampoo that you like. I don't even know what the popular brands are these days, but if it's a normal good, your income goes up, you're going to buy more of that freely without thinking about it. But if your income goes down, you may say, ooh, I'm going to buy the store brand instead because, it saves me $1 a bottle or 50 cents a bottle. I'm more cost conscious about my income, so I'm going to buy more inferior goods. Let me talk about something I know more. Toothpaste. I used to work for Colgate. Colgate Big Red, the normal toothpaste, or Colgate Total, is considered a normal good. Your people are more likely to buy it as their incomes are increasing, but if their incomes decrease, the Colgate product they buy might be their value brand, which is priced, it's still a good toothpaste, but it's priced lower, and it's called Ultra Bright. So a normal good, your everyday good that you would buy when you got lots of money. Inferior good, oh gee whiz, money's really tight, let me buy the value brand instead, where there's no advertising, there's the product is not supported with advertising, etc., so they can charge less money for it. Meats. A normal good might be filet, New York strip, T-bone, and New York strip and filet make up the two sides of the T in a T-bone. An inferior good may be flank steak. It's a cut of meat that is, you got to pound it almost with one of those meat mallets to make it, to tenderize it before you can eat it. Funny though, over time, an inferior cut of meat like flank steak becomes a delicacy because they've prepared it in such a way that people actually crave it. I would think if I go to a Mexican restaurant, I like arrachera, which is flank steak, but I probably would never buy it for home because it really requires lots of effort to make it taste good. French cuisine is based on bad meat, believe it or not. They developed magnificent sauces to enhance the flavor of inferior cuts of meat. So inferior doesn't mean it's a bad product. This is the definition. The demand falls when income rises and vice versa. Normal good, it follows the law of demand. Right? Well, normal good is the demand rises and falls with your income. This goes in the opposite direction of your income. The supply curve, if we look at this, can be used to show a minimum price if you have a price for a quantity supplied, here's the price that you're going to charge. So it's the minimum price a firm will accept to produce a given quantity. So if we have a price, we reflect it to the supply curve, and it says, okay, at that price, we're kind of willing to produce this much. Do people actually know this number? I think they look at more like the prices are going up, prices are going down, let's produce more, let's produce less. I would imagine maybe a sophisticated company like a large oil company might have, oh, at this price we should produce this much or not, but there's so many other factors that they're looking at. Are they behind on their annual, are they behind their budget or on their budget, ahead of their budget? That's all going to affect the kind of decisions they make in this regard. So here's kind of an economic conundrum here. Because most of the cost of production and desired profit equal the price the firm will set for a product, if the cost of production increases, the price for the product will also need to increase. So if we have cost of production and desired profit, here's cost of production and desired profit, we can sell it for this. But if the cost of production increases, people want to charge more. They'll want to make the same percentage profit on that. So the price will have to increase from P0. Let's say the new higher cost consumes all of this P0, which is where you were probably at for P0, Q0, and now you're going to have to go to a new price. You'd want to do this. But this doesn't happen independently. Companies, accountants like to set pricing this way. What does it cost me? What profit margin do I want to make? Well, let's charge that much. And then here's how much at that price. Gee whiz, I'm willing to supply a lot more. Why don't I do that? Well, guess what? You're fighting the demand curve at the same time. It's not a solo operation. Just because you raise the price does not mean people will buy that added quantity that you produced. So what could happen then is the supply shifts, and it shifts to the left, because as their costs go up, they're willing to maybe supply the same amount, because now they're not looking at price, they're looking at, I produce this quantity, but my cost structure went up, so my whole supply curve is going to shift over, and now at this price, that becomes the quantity I produce. Is that the quantity people are going to buy? Or because the price went up, people are now going to buy down here. When the cost of production increases, the supply curve shifts to the left. It says shifts up, but it shifts to the left, which means you're willing to supply less at the same price. You're willing to supply less at the same price. Now, at the price that they used to supply, Q0, P0, they're going to be supplying down here. Now, who's confused to death with all this explanation and all these curves and all these movements of the cursor around? You probably are. You have to there's a concept here. It's called, you got to study it to really understand this. If you don't like the way I explain it, watch AC/DC Economics. I'll provide a link for that where you can watch it. This guy is high energy. I always wanted to teach like him, and he explained things very well. If you don't like the way I explain it or our book explains it, find another book. Read the same concept. The whole internet is at your disposal to be able to understand these concepts. Now, shifting the supply curve. Well, just like the demand curve shifted, the supply curve shifts. Decreased supply means that every given price, the quantity supplied is lower. So that the supply curve shifts from to the left, from S0, which is like the middle ground here, it shifts over here. what happened with the oil companies when people started driving less. Well, they had to shift the demand curve shifted, the entire supply curve had to shift. What happens on the other side? If increased supply means that at every given price, the quantity supplied is higher, so that the supply curve shifts from the right to the right from S0 to S2. A shift in supply is when a change in some economic factor other than price causes a different quantity to be supplied at every price. Their inputs, what are the inputs or factors of production? Combination of labor, materials, and machinery that is used to produce goods and services. So the factors that naturally affect supply are natural conditions, input prices, technology, and government policies. Natural conditions. It's impossible to drill for oil for some reason or ship oil. So all of a sudden that will affect your supply. Your supply shifts downward. Input prices, your price input to produce or refine oil increases or decreases. If it decreases, your supply curve shifts to the right. If it increases, if your input prices of crude oil increase, you shift to the left. Technology, the ability, and this again, these can happen either quickly or over time as well. Technology can change things. If your ability to frack all of a sudden, as controversial as it is, fracking allows us to drill and extract shale oil from the ground. And if the price of gasoline goes too high, the technology now made the price of extracting shale oil lower. And so high gasoline prices or high crude oil prices favor, at some point, it becomes economically viable to extract shale oil. And the government policies allow fracking, which may play havoc on groundwater. Maybe it does. So all these factors play into it. So when the supply curve shifts to the right or increases for each given price, the supply increases. There's a favorable natural conditions for production, a fall in input prices, improved technology, lower product taxes or less costly regulations. If it shifts the other way, you have poor natural conditions for production, a rise in input prices, a decline in technology, which is usually not common because technology seems to march forward, but you have higher product taxes or more costly regulations. This is why some administrations are, oh, we're going to get rid of the regulations of drilling for oil in this area or that area, environmental concerns be damned. Next administration may say, no, we're going to put those back in place, and blah, blah, blah. So you have the two factors happening here. So here's a four-step process in changes in equilibrium, price, and quantity. Draw a demand and supply model before the economic change took place. Decide whether the economic change affects demand or supply. Could affect both. Decide whether, and then when you draw the first one, call it E1 or call it demand curve 1, supply curve 1, and equilibrium for that before the economic change took place. Call the equilibrium E1. Then, when you decide whether the economic changes affects demand or supply, decide whether the effect changes the curve shift to the right or left, and sketch a new curve on the diagram. Call that either demand 2 or supply 2. And then the new equilibrium point will be E2, and then you can see if it what the change was. So here's one. Use the four-step method. Demand did not change, but the supply curve shifted. Well, we see that in this case, quantity. This is fish and the price of fish. For some reason, our ability to fish for whatever it was increased. Maybe, I won't even speculate to guess why. But it could be like you use maybe some fishing method was illegal, now it's legal. Maybe a new technology like sonar allows you to find fish easier, and therefore you can harvest the same amount of fish in a lot less time, which means the costs go down. So the amount of fish that you're harvesting shifts from here to here. So at the same price, you have a larger quantity. So equilibrium first, S0, D0, I guess you can call it 0 and 1. I use 1 and 2 usually. But 0 being, the lower subscript. This is your first equilibrium point. Here's your second equilibrium point. This results in an increase in quantity consumed and a decrease in price. Price went from 325 to 250, and the quantity consumed went from 250 to 550. And that's what you're trying to determine. If supply is static but demand decreases, you're going to find you're at E0, where it's demand curve 0, the only supply curve in here. And then you have demand curve 1, so your equilibrium goes from here to here, decrease in quantity, decrease in price. When the supply curve is static and the demand curve shifts, price and quantity both go in the direction of the shift. So if demand was to increase, our new equilibrium point would be higher on the supply curve. Price goes up, quantity consumed goes up. If we look at demand curve being static and the supply curve shifting, here it shifted up, we find quantity consumed up, price and quantity go in opposite directions here. If we were here and it shifted, quantity would go down, price would go up. So when demand curve is static and the supply curve shifts, price or quantity goes in the direction of the shift, price goes in the opposite direction, up or down. When supply curve is static and demand curve shifts, both price and quantity go in the direction of the demand shift. So a combined exercise. Use a 4-step approach. What does an increase in labor compensation as well as an increase in digital communications suggest about the viability of the Postal Service? So first of all, we had a shift in supply, and then we had a shift in demand. Both the supply and demand shifted lower. What does that do for us? Higher labor compensation causes a leftward shift in the supply curve, a decrease in equilibrium quantity, and an increase in equilibrium price. A change in taste away from Postal Service causes a leftward shift in the demand curve, which resulted in a decrease in equilibrium quantity and a decrease in equilibrium price. So if you had both a shift, if you were to draw them on the same curve, it's the same S0, assume it's the same D0, and draw them on the same curve, what does that look like? And we'll spend some time on Friday talking about that. The book doesn't cover it. I kind of do. So if you have both happening at the same time, superimposing the two previous diagrams on top of each other, you got a lot of stuff happening, but basically you've gone from E0 to E3. And it doesn't happen in any progression. Forget about E1 and E2. That's if they happened independently. But it's E3 you're looking at, the E final. So quantity definitely went down. But the pricing, if you have actual pricing that you can look at, you can say what happened to the pricing. It looked like it went up slightly. But if there's no pricing here, the pricing becomes a question mark. So if both supply and demand shift down, the quantity will definitely shift down. When they both shift in the same direction, up or down, the quantity will go in the direction of the shift, but the pricing becomes a question mark. Unless you know the exact pricing of the specific thing you're looking at. We'll talk more about this. Movements are different than shift. A shift in one curve never causes a shift in the other curve. Rather, a shift in one curve causes a movement along the second curve. So if supply here's demand, and it doesn't shift, and supply shifts from S0 to S1 to S2, we move up and down that demand curve. But then if demand shifts and we're at S2, we move down S2. And we end up here. So we started here, we then went there, we finally end up here. So you had shift 1, shift 2, and then the demand curve shifted. And draw these arrows horizontally. Everything, when it shifts down, it's to the left. When it shifts up, it's to the right. So this is a shift in demand, a shift in demand downward, a shift in supply upward, a shift in demand downward. So now let's talk about price controls. A price ceiling. This keeps a price from rising above a certain level, a legal maximum price that one pays for some good or service. A price floor is a regulated price that keeps from falling below a given level. It's the lowest price that one can legally pay for a good or service. Now, when you look at it, the ceiling is kind of like here's this price ceiling. So, example of rent control. You have demand and supply. It shifts if demand shifts from D0 to D1, the new equilibrium price would be E1. So if the price shifts that way, the demand for rent increases, so here's your supply curve. I'm going to raise my rents because my demand increases. This happens a lot in large popular cities, New York City probably being the best example thereof. The demand shifts. We go from equilibrium price here to there. But we're going to say, no. At the lowest income levels, we're going to keep the rent the same. So we set a price ceiling. The price cannot go above the ceiling. Now, at this new demand, we see there's going to be an excess in demand or shortage from the price ceiling. We're going to be operating below the new equilibrium point, which means that, well, it's because supply only wants to supply this much at that price, and the demand at that price is this much now, because demand shifted. So here's the argument. Well, should not raise people's rents. Okay, poor people shouldn't have their rent raised. Their salaries are probably going to not change a lot. But the market has shifted. Now there's going to be less incentive for anybody to build low-income properties. So as they decay, and in fact, I'm going to have an incentive to take my low-income property, probably tear it down, and build something of a higher rent stature in it. So there's going to be less investment. There will be less housing for people that need it at that price. On the other hand, a price floor is above the equilibrium point. The ceiling is ceiling. Price can't go above this. It's below the equilibrium, causing a shortage in whatever it is you're looking at. A price floor is above the equilibrium price. So a price floor is above the equilibrium, a ceiling is below. The floor is above the ceiling. Huh? So it's not the most natural thing to understand. But we said a price floor means price can't go below here. Well, if the price can't go below there, what happens? Here's your equilibrium point where the price wants to be. You're not letting it go down. So you have an excess supply of wheat given the demand at that price. So what do you do with all that extra wheat? I guess we're looking at European wheat here. The other way of looking at it, and I'm not sure if we're covering that here. No, we're not. Is the most popular price floor that we look at is minimum wage. So if the equilibrium, now here supply and demand are a little different. Supply is the number of people looking for jobs. Demand is the demand from companies. So the supply is individuals. The demand is companies or firms looking to hire those individuals at a given price. Demand, they have demand for workers at a certain wage. So the equilibrium point is here. So if I chart in, always a minimum wage is above the equilibrium point. It makes no sense to set if the equilibrium point is higher than the minimum wage you're setting, just let the equilibrium point be it. People will get paid more and you don't have to intervene at all. But what happens is you think that, oh, gee whiz, people cannot make they cannot live on this wage. Let's try to get a more living wage, a more favorable term for them. And it's, gee whiz, it's not a bad thing to do because we're not heartless. We want people to be able to live on the salary they make if they work 40 hours a week. On the other hand, the economics doesn't care, and guess what? If we validate this model, it's actually worse off. That's the argument against minimum wage, is that you'll have less jobs because the demand for people at that higher wage will go down, but the supply of people working at that higher wage is going to go up, and therefore you're going to have an excess in supply or surplus of people looking for work at that wage than people actually offering jobs. So you're going to have a scarcity. You're going to have a surplus of people looking and a scarcity of jobs. So let's look at a couple ideas here. Demand, supply, efficiency, consumer surplus. This is the amount that individuals would have been willing to pay minus the amount they actually paid. It's the area above the market price and below the demand curve. Well, we're going to go back and forth between the next couple slides. Producer surplus is the price a producer actually received minus the price the producer would have been willing to accept, the area between the market price and the segment of the supply curve below the equilibrium. Social surplus and economic surplus and total slash total surplus is consumer surplus plus producer surplus. And this concept of deadweight loss is the loss in social surplus that occurs when a market produces an inefficient quantity. That's a lot to absorb right now. So let's look at this. Here's the demand curve. Here's the supply curve. We're used to that. There's our equilibrium point, always represented by E. Demand D, supply S. So the somewhat triangular area F, this area here, here's the equilibrium price, 80. When it's above that price, but below the demand curve, that's called a consumer surplus. So it shows that if we're in this area, the equilibrium price in the market was less than what the consumers are willing to pay. The somewhat triangular area here, G, is the area of producer surplus, which shows that the equilibrium price received in the market was greater than what many producers were willing to accept for their products. So, if we artificially sell in this area, so consumer surplus, producer surplus. Well, let's complicate it even more. And these are used when we talk about ceilings and floors. We have supply, demand, equilibrium price, or equilibrium, we have price, quantity, and then let's say we put a price floor, price ceiling right here at 415,000. Okay? So this is graph A. The regional equilibrium is 600 with a quantity of 20. Consumer surplus is T plus U. Right there. T plus U. And producer surplus is VW and X. A price ceiling is imposed at 400. So firms in the market now produce only a quantity of 15,000. As a result, the new consumer surplus is T plus V, while the new producer surplus is X. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about this and analyzing this, unfortunately. I think you're going to have to take a higher level of microeconomics, probably intermediate micro, to really get into this. Here, when you have a price floor, so what have we lost, though, when we've done that? The original producer surplus is X, and the producer surplus used to be V plus W plus X. So the producer lost out. The surplus is now only X. It's not V plus W, therefore producer's thinking, my incentive to produce more is diminished, I'm not going to do it. And guess what? It used to be T plus U, now it's T plus W, or T plus V for the consumer surplus. The consumer makes out, but the producer loses. Therefore, I'm not going to supply what the demand is. It just doesn't make sense for me. The original equilibrium in the other case here, when we have a price floor, notice this floor again is above the ceiling. We had an equilibrium of 8 and 1800, and now it's 12 and 1400. The consumer surplus is G plus H plus J, and the producer surplus was I plus K at the original equilibrium. Now we go over here, and what happens? The new consumer surplus is only G, and the new producer surplus is H plus I. So the consumer surplus went way down. It went from G plus H plus J to just G, and the producer surplus went from I plus K to H plus J, which became about the same, maybe more, hard to tell. But those buying are less incented to buy. So that's the minimum wage argument. Those hiring are less than willing to hire because their surplus just went from G plus H plus J to just G. They lose out and they don't want to participate. Okay, that's chapter 3. Thank you very much. We'll cover this in class as well.